I returned from a 2-month trip to Europe and found that my key no longer fit the front door of my own home. I pulled out my phone and called my son Trevor to ask what was going on. He answered with a heavy rehearsed sigh and told me the house was gone and that it was for my own good. I simply smiled, hung up the phone, and texted my lawyer that they took the bait and to file everything immediately. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart family members who thought they could take advantage of your generosity. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn of the property I had owned for 20 years. I stood on the porch and dropped my heavy leather suitcase onto the welcome mat. The neighborhood was quiet, and the air felt familiar and crisp. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the brass key that had opened this door 1,000 times before. I slid it into the deadbolt. The key slid halfway in and stopped abruptly. I pushed harder, but the metal ground against an unfamiliar mechanism. I pulled the key out and looked closely at the lock. The old tarnished fixture had been completely replaced with a brand new gleaming brass cylinder. I did not panic. I did not bang my fists against the heavy oak door. I stepped back and took a long, deep breath. The moment I had anticipated for months had finally arrived. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the number of my only son. The phone rang 3 times before Trevor answered. His voice lacked the casual warmth of a normal greeting. Instead, he sounded unnaturally calm and thoroughly prepared. I asked him directly why my key was not working and what was going on with my house. Trevor cleared his throat. He launched into a speech that sounded completely scripted. He told me that my cognitive abilities had been slipping for a long time. He claimed that he and his wife Melanie had been watching my mental decline with deep concern. He said that for my own safety and financial well-being, he had to make the difficult decision to step in and take control of my estate. He spoke to me slowly and loudly, as if I were a confused child wandering a supermarket aisle. I stood on the porch of the home I bought with cash and listened to my son erase my autonomy. Trevor then delivered the final blow. He instructed me to sit quietly on the porch bench. He said he had arranged for a private medical transport van to pick me up in 20 minutes. The van would take me to an assisted living facility where he had already secured a room for me. He promised to visit me on weekends and assured me that this was the best path forward for everyone. He told me not to wander off because the drivers were instructed to look for a disoriented elderly man. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice or hurl insults through the phone. I absorbed his betrayal in absolute silence. I told him I understood, and then I ended the call. A cold, calculated smile spread across my face. The sheer arrogance of his plan was exactly what I had counted on. I opened my messages and typed a single short text to my attorney, Bradley Foster. The message was simple. I told him they took the bait and instructed him to file the paperwork immediately. I picked up my suitcase and walked away from the front porch. I walked down the long driveway without looking back at the house. I opened a ride-sharing application on my phone and ordered a premium black car service. The vehicle arrived within 5 minutes. I instructed the driver to take me downtown to the financial district. I was technically homeless at that exact moment, but I felt entirely at peace. I leaned back into the leather seat of the car and watched the familiar suburban streets give way to towering glass skyscrapers. 3 months ago, I had quietly signed a year-long lease on a luxury penthouse apartment overlooking the river. The penthouse was fully furnished and fully stocked. I had prepared my sanctuary long before Trevor even finalized his plot. I swiped my access card in the private elevator and rode up to the top floor. I stepped into the massive living room and poured myself a glass of sparkling water. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the sprawling city. My son thought he had discarded a feeble old man. He had no idea that he had just willingly locked himself inside a devastating financial trap. I was not a victim waiting to be rescued. I was the architect of his impending ruin. My phone vibrated against the marble kitchen counter. Trevor had sent me a text message. I opened it and found a scanned PDF document attached. It was a copy of a general power of attorney. Trevor added a smug message telling me to cooperate with the facility staff because he now had full legal authority over my life. Seeing the document triggered a sharp memory from 6 months ago. I had spent 40 years building a regional logistics company from a single delivery truck into a massive enterprise. I sold the company 5 years ago and retired comfortably. My wealth had always been a shield for my family. I paid for Trevor to attend private universities, and I funded his lavish wedding to Melanie. I bought them their first home and covered their endless credit card debts. My generosity created monsters. 6 months ago, I returned home early from a golf tournament. I walked quietly into my private home office and found Melanie standing over my desk. She was using her smartphone to photograph my bank statements, tax returns, and investment portfolios. I stood in the doorway and watched her rapid, greedy movements. I realized in that terrifying instant that they did not love me. They viewed me as a walking automated teller machine that was taking too long to expire. I backed away quietly and let her finish her espionage. Instead of confronting them and demanding answers, I chose a different path. I went into my files and located an old, legally flawed power of attorney draft from a decade ago. It lacked the necessary notarization seals and referenced outdated state statutes. I deliberately placed that worthless document in the top drawer of my desk, where Melanie was sure to find it. I then booked a 2-month vacation to Europe, giving them the perfect window of opportunity to strike. The landline phone in the penthouse rang sharply. It was Bradley Foster calling with his initial report. Bradley confirmed that the trap was fully engaged. He explained the details of Trevor and Melanie's maneuver. While I was drinking espresso in Rome, Trevor had taken the flawed power of attorney to a corrupt or incompetent notary public. He had the document stamped and immediately used it to execute a quitclaim deed on my house. Trevor transferred the ownership of the $1.9 million property directly into a newly formed limited liability company. Bradley ran a search on the company and confirmed that Melanie was listed as the sole managing member. They had stolen my house and insulated themselves behind a corporate veil. Bradley then delivered the most crucial piece of information. Trevor had listed the house on the open real estate market 3 days ago. The property was completely empty and staged for immediate viewing. Trevor believed he was weeks away from cashing a check for nearly $2 million. He thought he had executed a flawless white-collar crime. The conflict shifted into a high-stakes race against the clock. Trevor was desperately seeking a wealthy buyer to liquidate the stolen asset. I had to ensure that the hidden mechanisms of my trap snapped shut before he could successfully transfer the title to an innocent third party. I thanked Bradley for his diligence and instructed him to monitor the public real estate listings every hour. I poured the rest of my water into the sink and smiled at my reflection in the dark window. Trevor had taken the house, but he had completely failed to understand what was attached to it. The battlefield was set, and I held every single advantage. The weekend arrived with clear skies and unseasonably warm weather. It was the perfect afternoon for a high-end real estate open house. I sat in the leather recliner of my downtown penthouse and opened my secure laptop. I had not spent the last 48 hours sitting idle. I had contacted a high-level corporate security firm and hired a licensed private investigator. The investigator was equipped with a discreet high-definition camera hidden securely inside his jacket lapel. I clicked a secure encrypted link on my screen, and the live video feed connected immediately. The frame stabilized, and I found myself looking at the front walkway of my own home. The investigator walked up the familiar stone path and stepped boldly through the open front door. The immediate visual changes were insulting. A strong smell of cheap synthetic vanilla candles wafted through the screen, attempting to mask the deep, rich history of the home. The investigator moved slowly into the expansive living room. Trevor and Melanie were standing near the marble fireplace. Trevor was wearing a tailored suit that I had paid for just 6 months prior. Melanie was wearing a designer dress that I had purchased for her birthday last year. They were both holding delicate crystal champagne flutes. The flutes belonged to my late wife and had been safely stored in a locked china cabinet for over a decade. They were casually pouring incredibly expensive champagne for a wealthy-looking couple who were touring the property. They looked exactly like a young, successful power couple who had conquered the world. I turned up the volume on my laptop and listened to their voices echo through the hidden microphone. Melanie spoke first. She waved her hand dismissively at the custom oak built-in bookshelves I had commissioned when Trevor was a little boy. She told the prospective buyers that the house possessed good structural bones, but the previous owner had horribly depressing and outdated taste. She laughed a high-pitched, grating laugh and called the decor aggressively old-fashioned. The buyers chuckled politely and nodded. Melanie took a long sip of champagne and leaned in closer to the buyers. She lowered her voice to a theatrical, conspiratorial whisper and began to weave a profoundly disgusting fabrication. She told them that the previous owner was her father-in-law. She claimed that taking care of me had become a massive emotional and financial burden on her and her husband. She described me as a deeply confused, paranoid, and ungrateful old man who violently refused to accept professional help. She painted herself as a tragic patient martyr who had sacrificed her own youth and happiness to manage my failing health and unmanageable temper. Trevor immediately stepped in to support the lie. He wrapped his arm tightly around Melanie and nodded with a look of manufactured sorrow. He told the buyers that making the decision to force me into a locked medical facility was the hardest thing he had ever done in his life. He completely fabricated a heartbreaking story about paying for my round-the-clock medical care out of his own pocket. He claimed they were being forced to sell this beautiful property solely to cover my exorbitant medical bills and to secure my future comfort. He looked the wealthy buyers right in the eye and lied without a single stutter or a single drop of sweat. The sheer ease with which he deceived those strangers was terrifying. He then smoothly pivoted the conversation back to the asking price. He boasted loudly about his brilliant real estate portfolio. He claimed he acquired this specific property through a highly strategic investment maneuver during a market downturn. He completely erased my 40 years of grueling hard work and claimed the massive equity as his own genius financial achievement. I sat alone in my silent penthouse and watched the high-definition feed stream across my screen. I listened to the crisp audio of my only son selling my legacy and destroying my character for a quick profit. Any tiny lingering shred of paternal guilt I might have harbored vanished completely in that exact moment. The last remaining fragment of the loving father who had protected and provided for Trevor evaporated into the cold, conditioned air of the apartment. I did not feel angry. I did not feel the urge to scream or throw things against the wall. I felt absolute, crystalline clarity. I watched Melanie pour another glass of my stolen champagne and laugh loudly at a joke the buyer made. She was celebrating a massive victory that did not actually exist. She was dancing triumphantly on the grave of a man who was very much alive and watching her every single move. The illusion of their total triumph was intoxicating to them. They were completely blinded by their own unchecked greed and their absolute certainty that I was powerless to stop them. The investigator moved through the kitchen and down the hallway, capturing every detail of their ruthless staging process. They had taken down all the family photographs from the hallway walls. They had shoved my personal belongings into cheap cardboard boxes and stacked them haphazardly in the damp garage. They were erasing me from the physical world just as eagerly as they were erasing me from their financial records. The buyers seemed incredibly interested in the property. The man asked Trevor about the potential closing timeline. Trevor confidently replied that they were looking for a rapid cash closing within 30 days. He promised a smooth and seamless title transfer, free of any familial complications. The sheer unearned confidence in his voice was sickening. He truly believed he held all the winning cards. He believed he had outsmarted the man who had taught him how to walk and how to read. The investigator eventually thanked them for the comprehensive tour and exited the house. The video feed cut to black as he stepped back onto the suburban sidewalk and headed toward his vehicle. I closed my laptop and folded my hands neatly on the desk. The open house had been a massive success for them. They had multiple interested parties walking through the door. They were eagerly accelerating their timeline. They were rushing headfirst toward the edge of a massive cliff with their eyes wide open. My resolve was now forged from unbreakable steel. There was absolutely no turning back from this path. I would not offer them a warning phone call. I would not offer them a chance to apologize and return the deed. I would let them sign the contracts and shake the hands of the buyers. I would let them climb to the absolute peak of their arrogance before I pulled the heavy lever and let the ground fall completely out from under them. The trap was perfectly laid, but I needed to ensure the heavy machinery of the bank began to move before Trevor could sign a binding purchase agreement. I picked up my phone to call my attorney again. The silent adjustment was ready to move into its next devastating phase. I left my penthouse the following morning and took a short walk through the financial district to the law offices of Bradley Foster. The morning air was cool and the city moved with a busy, chaotic energy that I found deeply comforting. Bradley met me in his expansive, glass-walled conference room overlooking the harbor. He pushed a thick, leather-bound folder across the polished mahogany table. I sat down and opened the folder to review the intricate mechanics of the financial snare we had so carefully constructed. Seeing the officially stamped documents laid out before me brought a profound sense of satisfaction. My son had spent his entire adult life taking the path of least resistance. He relied entirely on my wealth to solve his problems, and he never bothered to learn how money actually worked or how legal contracts functioned. That profound intellectual laziness was the exact weakness I had ruthlessly exploited to build this trap. I looked down at a copy of the original deed to my home. 12 years ago, I wrote a single massive check to completely pay off the original mortgage. I had worked 70-hour weeks for decades building my logistics company from the ground up, just to ensure that my family would never have to worry about a roof over their heads. I handed Trevor a life completely free of financial anxiety. He never saw the late nights I spent reviewing shipping manifests, or the crushing stress of covering payroll during severe economic downturns. He only saw the final luxurious result. He grew up believing that a $1.9 million house was simply a birthright that required absolutely zero maintenance or sacrifice. Because he had never truly worked for anything in his life, he possessed a highly dangerous combination of extreme arrogance and profound financial ignorance. When he decided to steal the property behind my back, he assumed the asset was sitting there completely free and clear, just waiting for him to cash it out and fund his early retirement. He completely failed to realize that I had recognized his growing greed long before he ever made his move. Exactly 3 weeks before I boarded my flight to Europe, I sat in this very same conference room with Bradley to execute my countermeasure. I signed the heavy stack of paperwork to initiate a massive home equity line of credit against the property. The commercial bank gladly approved the massive loan based on my pristine credit history and the independently verified appraised value of the home. I took out a loan for exactly $1.8 million. I deliberately drained the entire equity of the house in a single afternoon. The bank wired the massive sum of cash directly into my primary checking account. I certainly did not leave the money sitting there for Melanie to find during her pathetic espionage sessions. Within 24 hours of the funds clearing, Bradley executed a highly complex series of international wire transfers. We moved the entire $1.8 million into a legally impenetrable offshore trust. The trust was meticulously structured in a foreign jurisdiction that absolutely does not recognize domestic civil judgments. The money was completely invisible to my family and entirely untouchable by anyone except me. I closed the heavy leather folder and leaned back in my chair, feeling the tension leave my shoulders. Trevor had moved so incredibly fast to execute his fraudulent deed transfer that he skipped the most basic step of any standard real estate transaction. Driven entirely by greed and the false timeline of my European vacation, he did not hire a professional title company to run a standard preliminary title search. If he had spent a mere $50 to check the county public records, he would have clearly seen the massive active lien attached to the property. He was so blinded by the prospect of a $2 million payday that he simply forged my signature and filed the paperwork. By fraudulently transferring the deed into his newly formed corporate entity, he did not just steal the physical bricks and mortar of the house. He unwittingly assumed total legal and financial liability for the massive hidden debt directly attached to the property. He truly thought he had stolen a golden goose that would fund his extravagant lifestyle forever. Instead, he had permanently chained himself to a $1.8 million anvil. The stolen house was essentially legally toxic and financially worthless to him now. Every single day that passed brought him one step closer to the commercial bank, discovering the unauthorized deed transfer and violently demanding their money back. Bradley smiled a thin, tight smile and poured me a cup of strong black coffee. We had positioned all the pieces perfectly on the board. We simply had to sit back in the quiet comfort of the office and wait for the massive debt bomb to detonate directly in my son's face. It took exactly 3 days for Trevor to secure a buyer for the house. The aggressive cash offer came from an out-of-state corporate investor who wanted to close the transaction in 14 days. Trevor did not even attempt to negotiate the price or the terms. He accepted the offer immediately and signed the digital contracts. He and Melanie were practically vibrating with excitement. I tracked the change in the public listing status directly from my penthouse computer. The property was officially marked as pending sale on every major real estate website. They were so incredibly close to the finish line, they could probably smell the freshly printed money. They started making lavish, immediate plans for their stolen wealth. I monitored their public social media accounts through an anonymous profile. Melanie posted pictures of expensive luxury vehicles and tagged high-end exotic island resorts. They were spending the $2 million in their heads before the ink on the purchase agreement was even dry. They felt completely invincible. They firmly believed they had successfully discarded a vulnerable old man and stolen his entire life fortune without facing a single negative consequence. Their arrogance was completely blinding them to the reality of the minefield they were sprinting across. Trevor wanted the cash wired into his bank account as fast as humanly possible. He immediately forwarded the signed purchase agreement to a prominent local title and escrow company. He instructed them to open the file and expedite the closing process with top priority. In a standard American real estate transaction, the title company acts as the essential neutral third party. Their primary job is to meticulously verify that the seller actually has the legal right to sell the property. They must ensure that there are no hidden debts judgments or legal claims attached to the physical address. Trevor was so completely consumed by his own greed and his perceived superiority that he fundamentally misunderstood this entire process. He honestly thought the title search was just a simple administrative formality. He thought the escrow officers would just stamp a few arbitrary papers and wire him the cash. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed a massive magnifying glass to a team of seasoned financial investigators. The senior title officer assigned to his file was a highly meticulous professional with 20 years of real estate experience. She sat at her desk and opened the county records database. She typed in the address of my property and initiated a comprehensive background search. The automated county system generated a detailed property profile within seconds. The initial pages displayed the original deed from 20 years ago and the historical mortgage that I had dutifully paid off over a decade ago. If Trevor had ever bothered to conduct his own rudimentary research, this was exactly the clean history he expected to find. But the senior title officer kept scrolling down the digital document to the active encumbrances section. Right there in bold, undeniable black text was the officially recorded deed of trust for the massive home equity line of credit. The official county record clearly showed a primary active lien of exactly $1.8 million registered to a major national commercial bank. The date of the loan origination was explicitly recorded as precisely 3 weeks before Trevor fraudulently transferred the deed into his own corporate entity. The title officer immediately flagged the file in her system. You absolutely cannot legally sell a house and keep the cash if there is an active institutional loan attached to the property. The bank must be fully satisfied first. It is the most basic unbending rule of real estate law. The officer quickly calculated the estimated payoff amount. Including the daily accumulating interest, the total mandatory debt now exceeded the entire cash offer Trevor had just eagerly accepted. The title officer picked up her desk phone and dialed the contact number Trevor had provided on the intake form. Trevor answered the phone on the second ring with the cheerful, relaxed tone of a man expecting a finalized settlement statement and a massive payday. The officer introduced herself professionally and calmly explained the critical situation. She told him directly that she could not issue a clean title policy for his out-of-state buyer. She informed him that there was an outstanding commercial bank lien of $1.8 million permanently attached to the property. She politely asked Trevor to provide the contact information and account numbers for the bank so she could officially order the formal payoff demand. I was not in the room with him when he received that call, but I could easily imagine the color draining completely from his face. His very first moment of genuine cold panic struck him like a physical blow to the chest. The fragile foundation of his brilliant criminal plan violently cracked beneath his feet. He immediately became defensive and verbally aggressive. He raised his voice and angrily told the officer she was completely incompetent at her job. He aggressively insisted that the house was owned completely free and clear of any debts. He claimed my name was previously on the deed and that I was a wealthy man who owed absolutely nothing to anyone. He frantically told her it had to be a massive clerical error made by an underpaid county recorder office employee. He loudly promised her he would make a few phone calls and fix her stupid mistake by the end of the business day. He hung up the phone with trembling, sweaty hands. He stared at his phone screen in absolute silence for several long minutes. The sudden, heavy weight of reality began to crush the oxygen out of his lungs. He tried to rationalize the terrifying situation. He told himself that I was just a confused old man who probably signed up for a scam credit card. He tried to convince himself that a $1.8 million loan was physically impossible to secure without his knowledge. But deep down in the dark corners of his mind, a terrifying new thought began to take root. He started to wonder if I was actually fully aware of my surroundings before I left for Europe. He started to wonder if the flawed power of attorney was not just a lucky accident. Trevor paced back and forth across his living room floor, breathing heavily. The illusion of his effortless victory was beginning to shatter into 1,000 sharp pieces. The conflict had just violently shifted completely out of his control. He was no longer the apex predator of this situation. He was suddenly a desperate man backed into a very dark corner, fighting against a massive financial institution. He grabbed his car keys and told Melanie he was going to the county clerk office to clear up a tiny paperwork glitch. He walked out the door with a forced fake smile masking his rapidly escalating terror. The silent adjustment had successfully drawn its first drop of blood. Trevor did not handle the devastating news from the title company with any kind of grace. He drove straight home and immediately told his wife about the $1.8 million lien blocking their massive payday. I knew exactly how Melanie would react to this information. She was a woman who never accepted defeat and always blamed others for her own failures. Instead of realizing they had walked blindly into a meticulously designed trap, she immediately assumed this was a pathetic, desperate act of sabotage. She genuinely believed that I was sitting in a dreary room at the assisted living facility, using a smuggled phone to artificially block the sale of the house. She thought the lien was just a fake legal maneuver I had somehow orchestrated to scare the buyers away. Her greed quickly mutated into absolute vindictive rage. She decided that if I was going to play games with her future, she was going to completely destroy my present. Melanie formulated a plan to entirely cut off my life support. She wanted to strip away any remaining financial safety net I might possess. She believed that if she drained my liquid cash and froze my bank accounts, I would be forced to surrender and sign whatever documents they needed to clear the house title. She went into Trevor and his home office and retrieved the fraudulent general power of attorney document. She placed the forged paperwork into her expensive designer handbag and marched out the front door. She drove her luxury car directly to the main downtown branch of my primary financial institution. This was the exact bank where I had maintained my personal and corporate accounts for over 30 years. She walked through the heavy glass doors, with her chin held high and a look of absolute authority painted on her face. She truly believed she was about to conquer my entire world. She bypassed the regular line and walked directly up to the desk of a senior branch manager. She introduced herself as my legal guardian and financial proxy. She pulled the forged document from her bag and placed it firmly on the polished mahogany desk. She demanded immediate and total access to all of my checking accounts, my savings accounts, and my investment portfolios. She instructed the manager to freeze every single card associated with my name so that I could not spend another dime without her explicit permission. She then demanded a cashier check for the entire liquid balance of my accounts. Melanie was expecting to walk out of that building with hundreds of thousands of dollars. She knew my history of success, and she assumed my primary accounts were overflowing with cash. She sat in the comfortable leather chair and waited for the manager to hand over my life savings. The branch manager politely reviewed the document and typed my account information into his computer terminal. I had anticipated this exact aggressive maneuver weeks ago. I knew that their boundless greed would eventually lead them directly to my bank vault. Long before I boarded my flight to Europe, I had systematically emptied every single account tied to that institution. I moved my wealth into secure offshore entities and diversified trusts that Melanie could never even conceptualize, let alone access. The manager looked at his screen and then looked back up at Melanie with a thoroughly confused expression. He politely informed her that the accounts were indeed active, but there was a significant issue with her withdrawal request. He turned the monitor slightly so she could see the glowing numbers on the screen. He told her that the total combined balance of my primary checking and savings accounts was exactly $12. Melanie stared at the computer screen in complete disbelief. The color drained from her face and her jaw tightened in absolute fury. She demanded that the manager check the system again. She raised her voice and accused the bank of making a massive administrative error. She insisted that a man of my wealth simply had to have more money hidden in those accounts. The manager remained perfectly calm and assured her that the $12 balance was completely accurate. He explained that all major funds had been lawfully transferred out of the institution weeks prior. Melanie realized in that agonizing moment that she was not going to get a single penny. Her grand plan to financially suffocate me had failed completely because there was absolutely nothing left to take. She snatched the forged document off the desk, shoved it back into her bag, and stormed out of the bank. She walked back to her car, trembling with uncontainable anger. She drove away from the bank feeling humiliated and furious. She had absolutely no idea that she had just committed a catastrophic, unforced error. She was so blinded by her rage over the missing money that she completely failed to understand the monumental legal line she had just crossed. By willfully walking into a federally insured bank and presenting a forged legal document to seize assets, she had instantly escalated her crimes. She was no longer just dealing with a messy family real estate dispute. She had just committed blatant felony bank fraud and felony wire fraud. What Melanie did not know was that my attorney, Bradley Foster, had heavily prepared for this specific intrusion. When we emptied those accounts, we did not just leave them dormant. Bradley had filed a highly classified legal notice with the bank and their internal fraud department. He established a silent tripwire on my financial profile. The moment Melanie handed that forged power of attorney to the branch manager, the bank system automatically triggered a severe federal fraud alert. While she was screaming about the $12 balance, the bank was already digitally transmitting the forged document and her identifying information directly to federal law enforcement agencies. Melanie thought she was just walking away empty-handed. She had no clue that the massive gears of the criminal justice system had just locked onto her and began to turn. The conflict had reached a terrifying new level, and my enemies were completely unaware of their impending destruction. Trevor and Melanie spent the next 24 hours frantically tearing through my abandoned mail and calling local transport companies, trying to locate the cheap assisted living facility they assumed I had quietly surrendered to. They fully expected to find me sitting in a dreary fluorescent-lit common room, eating bland oatmeal and waiting for the end of my life. Their sheer desperation drove them to bribe a dispatch operator from the private medical van service Trevor had originally hired. The operator gave them the address I had actually requested on the day I was locked out. They typed the destination into their navigation system and drove angrily into the heart of the downtown financial district. They did not pull up to a depressing concrete nursing home. Instead, their car arrived at the polished brass and gleaming glass entrance of the most exclusive luxury high-rise residential tower in the entire city. The sheer opulence of the building immediately shattered their preconceived notions of my defeat. They handed their keys to the complimentary valet and walked through the towering double doors into a lobby covered in imported Italian marble and rich mahogany paneling. They marched directly toward the massive circular security desk with the blind entitlement of people who believed they owned the entire world. Trevor slammed his hand down on the polished stone counter and demanded the room number for Richard Dalton. He spoke to the impeccably dressed concierge with the same condescending tone he used on waitstaff and bank tellers. The concierge did not flinch. He simply asked for their names and checked his digital guest registry. I had explicitly instructed the building management to flag any unannounced visitors, especially my son and his wife. The concierge politely but firmly informed Trevor that I was not receiving guests and asked them to vacate the premises immediately. Trevor completely lost whatever fragile grip he still had on his temper. The polished veneer of the successful real estate investor vanished instantly. He began screaming at the top of his lungs in the middle of the pristine lobby. He yelled that he was my legal guardian, and that I was a severely mentally compromised old man who had wandered away from professional medical care. He threatened to call the police and have the concierge arrested for kidnapping a vulnerable senior citizen. Melanie stood beside him, nodding furiously and shouting her own threats about multi-million-dollar lawsuits. Their pathetic public tantrum echoed off the high ceilings, drawing the disgusted stares of wealthy residents and corporate executives passing through the lobby. The concierge calmly picked up his secure telephone and dialed my penthouse extension. I was sitting on my balcony enjoying a cup of imported tea when the phone rang. The concierge apologized for the disturbance and informed me that my son was currently causing a severe security incident downstairs. I thanked him for his extreme professionalism and told him I would be right down to handle the situation. I straightened my tailored suit jacket and stepped into the private glass elevator. I watched the city skyline blur past as I descended 50 floors to the lobby. I felt absolutely no anxiety or fear. I felt the cold, precise energy of a surgeon stepping up to an operating table. The elevator doors chimed and parted smoothly. I walked across the marble floor with a steady, measured pace. Trevor and Melanie were red-faced and sweating heavily as two muscular security guards began to herd them toward the revolving exit doors. I raised my hand slightly, and the guards stopped. I stepped firmly behind the massive marble security desk, placing a physical and symbolic barrier between myself and their frantic desperation. I looked at them, not as a father looking at his children, but as a man studying two deeply flawed strangers. Trevor shoved past the security guard and threw a crumpled piece of paper directly onto the marble counter. It was a standard lien release form hastily printed from the internet. His hands were shaking violently. He pointed a trembling finger at the document and ordered me to sign it immediately. He completely abandoned the fake narrative of caring for my declining mental health. He demanded that I release the $1.8 million debt from the property so he could finalize his cash sale. He actually had the audacity to command me to fix the massive, catastrophic problem he had created by stealing my home. He spoke to me like a disobedient dog, demanding that I instantly erase the financial anvil currently dragging him to the bottom of the ocean. He tried to project strength, but his voice was thin and brittle, cracking under the immense pressure of his impending ruin. Melanie stood right behind his shoulder, glaring at me with absolute venom. She demanded that I stop playing these stupid games and give them what was rightfully theirs. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that they were demanding a man they had just tried to render homeless hand them millions of dollars for absolutely nothing in return. I did not reach for the paper. I did not even look down at the document. I kept my eyes locked directly onto Trevor and his terrified, sweating face. I spoke in a quiet, even voice that easily cut through the remaining echoes of his tantrum. I calmly informed him that I would not be signing anything today or any other day. I reminded him that he was the sole legal owner of the corporate entity that currently held the deed to the property. I clearly explained that because he had so eagerly transferred the ownership into his own name, the massive commercial debt was now his exclusive legal responsibility. I told him he was standing in the lobby of a building he could never afford, demanding charity from a man he had actively tried to destroy. My absolute refusal struck him like a physical blow. He realized in that agonizing second that his aggressive bullying tactics were completely useless against me. The panic in his eyes hardened into a desperate, cornered rage. He slammed his fists against the marble desk and screamed his final perceived trump card. He threatened to drag me into a public courtroom and have a judge declare me entirely legally incompetent. He swore he would bring in a team of aggressive lawyers to prove my mind was gone, so he could legally force the signature himself and strip away every single right I had left as a human being. The conflict had reached its absolute breaking point, and he had just handed me the perfect weapon to destroy him. The echo of his threat hung heavily in the chilled air of the luxury lobby. He had just screamed his intention to strip away my fundamental human rights in front of strangers. He wanted to drag me before a judge and have me declared legally incompetent. He wanted to officially reduce me to the status of a helpless infant, so he could force my signature on a piece of paper and save himself from a $1.8 million disaster. For most men my age, that threat is the ultimate terror. The fear of losing your autonomy and being locked away in a ward against your will is a dark shadow that haunts the elderly. Trevor stood there, panting heavily with his chest puffed out. He honestly believed he had just played an unbeatable trump card. He thought he had found the ultimate leverage to break my spirit and force my compliance. He looked at me with wild, desperate eyes, waiting for me to crumble and beg for mercy. He expected me to panic and negotiate. He had absolutely no idea that I had seen this exact cowardly move coming from a mile away. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice in defense of my own sanity. I simply reached a steady hand into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket. As my fingers brushed against the thick, folded envelope resting against my chest, a very specific memory rushed through my mind. I thought back to exactly 3 days before my scheduled flight to Europe. While Trevor and Melanie were busy plotting their theft, I was actively securing my armor. I knew how greedy people operated when they were backed into a corner. I had heard Melanie whispering about my supposed forgetfulness whenever I misplaced my reading glasses. I knew they would eventually try to weaponize my age against me if their initial fraud was ever challenged. Instead of packing my suitcases that day, I drove myself to the most prestigious private medical research institute in the state. I did not go for a routine checkup. I voluntarily submitted myself to a grueling, comprehensive 12-hour psychiatric and neurological evaluation. I spared absolutely no expense to secure the truth. I sat in brightly lit clinical rooms and underwent extensive brain imaging scans to prove there was zero physical deterioration in my frontal lobe. I sat across a table from the senior chief of neurology and completed highly complex cognitive stress tests designed to push my executive functioning to its absolute limits. I was evaluated by a board-certified forensic psychiatrist who specialized in elder competency cases for high-net-worth estates. They tested my memory, recall my logical reasoning, and my situational awareness. They grilled me on complex financial scenarios and legal definitions to ensure I completely understood the ramifications of my own wealth. The 3 independent specialists compiled their findings into a massive unified report. The final medical conclusion was absolutely bulletproof. They documented that my mental acuity was in the top 1 percentile for my age demographic. They officially declared that my cognitive function was pristine, my judgment was flawless, and my capacity to make autonomous legal decisions was entirely unimpaired. I pulled the thick envelope from my jacket pocket and dropped it onto the cold marble counter. The heavy thud of the paper seemed to echo louder than Trevor and his screaming. I did not break eye contact with him. I calmly instructed him to open the envelope and read the first page. Trevor hesitated for a fraction of a second before his trembling hands snatched the envelope off the counter. He ripped the top open and pulled out the crisp, watermarked documents. His eyes frantically scanned the dense medical terminology and the prominent bold headings. He saw the official embossed seals of the private medical institute. He saw the signatures of 3 separate board-certified physicians. I kept my voice perfectly level and quiet as I narrated exactly what he was holding. I told him that he was holding irrefutable, legally binding proof of my absolute mental perfection. I explained that those evaluations were conducted just 3 days before he decided to steal my house. I watched the last remaining drops of color drain completely out of his face. I stepped slightly closer to the marble desk and delivered the final crushing blow to his pathetic strategy. I calmly explained the legal reality of what would happen if he ever dared to step inside a courthouse and file a guardianship petition against me. I told him that the moment his lawyers submitted their fraudulent claims of my mental decline, my attorney would simply hand this document to the presiding judge. I explained that the judge would instantly throw his petition out of court with extreme prejudice, but I assured him it would not end there. I promised him that Bradley Foster would immediately counter-sue him for malicious prosecution, elder harassment, and filing a frivolous lawsuit. I told him that attempting to falsely declare a sane, wealthy man incompetent was a fast track to severe financial sanctions and potential criminal perjury charges. I made it crystal clear that his ultimate trump card was absolutely worthless. Trevor lowered the medical evaluation slowly. The papers rattled loudly in his shaking hands. The arrogant, demanding real estate investor had completely vanished. He was replaced by a terrified little boy who suddenly realized he was trapped in a cage with a tiger he had foolishly provoked. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He looked over at Melanie, expecting her to have some brilliant backup plan or some sharp insult to throw at me. But Melanie was completely silent. She stared at the medical documents in his hands with wide, horrified eyes. She understood the catastrophic implications just as clearly as he did. They were out of leverage. They were out of legal maneuvers. They could not bully me, and they could not forcefully declare me insane. They were entirely trapped with a stolen house and a massive $1.8 million commercial bank debt that was rapidly accumulating daily interest. The threat of forced incompetency was neutralized instantly and permanently. The conflict shifted violently once again. They had come to the luxury penthouse to demand my surrender. Instead, I had just systematically destroyed their last remaining hope of survival. I told them to leave the building immediately before I instructed security to physically throw them out onto the street. Trevor dropped the medical papers back onto the marble counter. He turned around without saying a single word and walked toward the revolving doors. The heavy machinery of their total destruction was finally locked into place, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. The drive back from the downtown luxury penthouse to the stolen suburban house was completely silent. Trevor gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, while Melanie stared blankly out the passenger window. They pulled into the driveway of the $1.9 million property that was supposed to be their golden ticket. They walked through the front door, and the oppressive silence of the empty staged house swallowed them whole. The cheap synthetic vanilla candles had burned down to the glass, leaving a cloying, nauseating smell in the air. Trevor walked directly to the kitchen and poured himself a large glass of my expensive bourbon. Despite the absolute humiliation they had just suffered in the high-rise lobby, his toxic arrogance began to seep back into his mind. He refused to accept that he had been completely outplayed by a man he considered obsolete. He paced across the hardwood floors and began to aggressively rationalize their devastating defeat. He told Melanie that my perfectly executed medical evaluation was just a temporary roadblock. He stubbornly insisted that he could find a sleazy, aggressive attorney who would gladly challenge the medical documents in a prolonged court battle. He convinced himself that they still held the ultimate physical prize because his newly formed corporate entity was officially listed on the county deed. He took a long swallow of bourbon and arrogantly proclaimed that they just needed to wait me out. He believed that if they simply held their ground, the pressure would eventually force me to negotiate. He was clinging to the pathetic illusion of control, completely unaware that a massive corporate machine was already moving to crush him. While Trevor was drinking my liquor and spinning desperate fantasies, the immense automated compliance system of the National Commercial Bank was silently doing its job. When I initially took out the $1.8 million home equity line of credit, the bank naturally placed a massive lien on the property to secure their investment. Commercial banks do not simply hand out millions of dollars and forget about it. They employ highly sophisticated software that continuously monitors county public records for any unauthorized changes to the collateral. When Trevor foolishly rushed to the county clerk office and filed the fraudulent quitclaim deed to transfer the property into Melanie and her corporate entity, he tripped a massive digital alarm. The bank system immediately detected the unauthorized change in ownership. In the strict legal architecture of American real estate finance, there is a standard mandatory provision known as the due on sale clause. This rigid legal mechanism dictates that if a property is transferred or sold to a new owner without the explicit prior written consent of the lender, the entire outstanding balance of the loan becomes immediately due and payable in full. Trevor did not read the fine print of my financial history because he was entirely blinded by his own greed. He assumed the house was a free and clear asset. He fundamentally failed to understand that by legally forcing the deed into his own name, he had violently triggered that exact acceleration clause. The bank did not care about family disputes or fraudulent power of attorney documents. They only cared about their $1.8 million exposure. The commercial lending division immediately flagged the unauthorized transfer as a critical default event. Their high-powered legal department quickly drafted a formal notice of acceleration. The very next morning, a postal courier walked up the driveway of my former home. Trevor was sitting on the staged living room sofa, desperately scrolling through the contacts on his phone, trying to find a lawyer who would take his case. The sharp ring of the doorbell echoed through the empty house. Trevor eagerly jumped up and practically ran to the front door. He genuinely believed that the title company had magically resolved the paperwork issue and sent a courier to finalize his massive cash payout. He swung the door open and hastily scribbled his signature on the electronic delivery pad without even reading the return address. The courier handed him a thick, certified envelope and walked away. Trevor ripped open the heavy cardboard envelope and pulled out a stack of dense legal documents printed on thick premium paper. The bold red header at the top of the first page bore the official logo of the massive National Commercial Bank. Trevor stood in the foyer and began to read the formal declaration. The document was completely devoid of emotion. It was written with the cold, terrifying precision of corporate law. The letter formally notified his newly formed limited liability company that an unauthorized transfer of the property deed had been officially detected. It clearly stated that this unauthorized transfer constituted a severe and irreversible breach of the original loan covenant. The following paragraph delivered the fatal mathematical blow. The bank officially invoked the due on sale clause and demanded the immediate and total repayment of the entire home equity line of credit. The letter clearly laid out the exact figures, including the massive principal balance and the daily compounding interest penalties. The total amount demanded was well over $1.8 million. Trevor felt the blood drain completely from his face as his eyes darted to the bottom of the page. The bank did not offer a payment plan or an opportunity to negotiate. They issued a rigid, non-negotiable ultimatum. The letter explicitly stated that Trevor had exactly 14 days to produce the entire $1.8 million in certified funds. If he failed to wire the money by the close of business on the 14th day, the bank would immediately initiate hostile foreclosure proceedings and seize the property. Trevor dropped the envelope onto the floor. His breathing became incredibly shallow and ragged. The true, devastating brilliance of my trap finally fully materialized in his mind. He realized that the fraudulent quitclaim deed he had so proudly filed was not a golden ticket. It was a legal death sentence. By forcing the title into his corporate entity, he had legally assumed total responsibility for the massive hidden debt attached to the physical address. He had stolen a house he could never afford and chained himself to an anvil that was rapidly pulling him to the bottom of the ocean. He could not sell the house to pay the debt because the title was frozen. He could not return the house to me because the fraud had already been committed and I would never accept it. The arrogance he had displayed just 24 hours earlier evaporated completely, leaving behind only the crushing, suffocating reality of his own absolute destruction. He was trapped in a 14-day countdown to financial oblivion, and there was absolutely no one coming to save him. While Trevor was still standing in the foyer, staring blankly at the 14-day foreclosure notice, the real consequences of their greed finally arrived at the front door. He had spent the last hour pacing back and forth across the staged living room, muttering to himself and trying to formulate a plan to somehow borrow $1.8 million from private lenders. Melanie was sitting on the expensive staging furniture, sipping a glass of white wine and telling him to calm down. She was still completely oblivious to the massive digital tripwire she had triggered during her arrogant visit to my bank the previous afternoon. She honestly believed that her only failure was walking away from the teller without my cash. She had absolutely no idea that the moment the bank manager scanned that forged power of attorney, the internal security system had automatically compiled a comprehensive fraud dossier. The bank did not just deny her withdrawal request and move on. They transmitted the digital evidence directly to a federal financial crimes task force. The federal agents reviewed the blatant forgery and immediately forwarded the urgent file down to the local financial crimes division of the city police department. I knew exactly when this would happen because Bradley had explained the precise timeline of the automated federal alerts. I sat in my comfortable penthouse and checked my watch, knowing the police were already on their way. The heavy silence of the suburban neighborhood was suddenly broken by the sound of tires crunching against the gravel of the long driveway. Two unmarked dark sedans pulled up and parked directly behind Trevor and his luxury car, blocking it in completely. 4 plainclothes detectives stepped out of the vehicles. They were not wearing standard uniforms, but they moved with the heavy, unmistakable authority of law enforcement officers who had absolutely zero interest in making polite conversation. They walked up the stone pathway, their eyes scanning the pristine exterior of the stolen $1.9 million property. Trevor watched them through the large front window, and his heart completely stopped beating. He genuinely thought the commercial bank had sent armed guards to forcibly evict them right then and there. He dropped the heavy foreclosure letter onto the floor and backed away from the window. The lead detective did not politely ring the doorbell. He pounded his heavy fist against the solid oak door 3 times. The sound echoed through the empty staged house like a series of gunshots. Trevor looked at Melanie with absolute sheer terror in his eyes. He slowly walked over and unlocked the deadbolt, pulling the heavy door open just a few inches. The lead detective pushed the door open the rest of the way, stepping directly into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. He flashed a gold badge and asked for Melanie by her full legal maiden name. Melanie stood up from the sofa, and her wineglass trembled slightly in her hand. She put on a fake customer service smile and walked toward the detectives, asking how she could help them. She expected them to ask about a minor traffic violation, or perhaps a neighborhood dispute regarding the open house. She was completely unprepared for the devastating reality they brought into her living room. The detective did not return her smile. He looked her right in the eye and coldly informed her that she was the primary target of an active felony fraud investigation. He explained exactly what she had done the day before in excruciating detail. He described her walking into a federally insured financial institution and presenting a revoked, outdated legal document with the explicit intent to misappropriate funds. Melanie felt the blood rush out of her head, and she immediately started stammering out a pathetic, nervous defense. She tried to tell them that it was just a simple family misunderstanding, and that she was my legal guardian acting in my best interest. The detective cut her off completely and refused to listen to her lies. He explained the law to her with brutal, terrifying clarity. He told her that attempting to use a fraudulent document to access another person's bank account across state or digital lines is not a simple family dispute. It constitutes felony wire fraud and attempted grand larceny under federal banking regulations. He informed her that the federal alert system had already flagged her identity and frozen all of her personal financial accounts, pending a full, comprehensive investigation. Melanie gasped loudly and dropped her wineglass onto the hardwood floor, where it shattered into a dozen pieces. Her arrogant illusion of total control vanished instantly and was replaced by pure dread. The second detective pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and handed it to Trevor. It was a comprehensive search and seizure warrant signed by a criminal court judge just 2 hours prior. The warrant explicitly authorized the detectives to confiscate any electronic devices, financial records, and communication logs located inside the premises. The detectives walked past Trevor and Melanie and began moving methodically through the staged house, tearing apart their carefully constructed facade. They found the home office and unplugged Melanie and her expensive silver laptop computer. They placed the machine inside a clear plastic evidence bag, sealing it tightly. They opened the desk drawers and confiscated every single folder containing bank statements, loan applications, and real estate contracts. They found the original copy of the forged power of attorney and bagged it as the primary physical evidence of her crime. They physically stripped away the very tools she had used to orchestrate my supposed downfall. Melanie stood frozen in the middle of the living room, watching the detectives carry her entire life out the front door in clear plastic bags. She realized that she had blindly walked directly into a massive federal trap. She had tried to steal my safety net, and instead she had wrapped a heavy legal noose tightly around her own neck. Trevor stood next to her, completely paralyzed by his own mounting fear. He looked down at the bank foreclosure letter lying on the floor, and then looked at the detectives walking out to their cars with the evidence. The crushing reality of their situation finally crystallized in his mind. He realized they were no longer just fighting a stressful real estate battle to sell a house. They were fighting a catastrophic war on 2 completely different fronts. On one side, the massive commercial bank was rapidly closing in to seize the property and hold him personally liable for a $1.8 million debt. On the other side, the criminal justice system was actively building a felony fraud case that carried a mandatory federal prison sentence. They had absolutely no money, no leverage, and no escape route. Their boundless greed had trapped them in a burning building with all the doors permanently locked from the outside. The unmarked police vehicles backed slowly out of the long gravel driveway and disappeared down the quiet suburban street. Trevor stood frozen in the empty foyer, listening to the sound of his wife sobbing hysterically in the staged living room. The heavy 14-day foreclosure notice from the massive commercial bank still lay discarded on the polished hardwood floor. The crushing reality of their situation settled heavily over his shoulders. They were entirely trapped between a massive financial institution demanding $1.8 million and a federal task force aggressively building a felony criminal case. Trevor realized that if he did not pay the bank immediately, the entire real estate fraud would be exposed in open court during the public foreclosure hearings. He convinced himself that if he could just come up with the massive amount of cash to satisfy the commercial loan, he could magically make the entire nightmare disappear. He thought he could pay off the massive debt and then quietly dissolve the newly formed corporate entity before the police found more evidence. He believed he could somehow walk away cleanly if he just erased the immediate financial footprint of his arrogant theft. He walked into the living room and told Melanie to stop crying. He promised her he was going to fix everything by the end of the day. He turned around and walked out to the massive 3-car garage and turned on the bright fluorescent overhead lights. The garage was a pristine, climate-controlled showroom of his completely unearned wealth. Parked side by side were 2 incredibly expensive imported sports cars. A massive luxury speedboat sat resting on a custom steel trailer in the 3rd spacious bay. I had purchased every single one of those luxury vehicles for him over the course of the last 5 years. He had never made a single loan payment or covered a single insurance premium with his own earned money. He viewed those expensive vehicles as his ultimate personal status symbols, but in that desperate, terrified moment, they suddenly became his only available life rafts. Trevor pulled out his cell phone and began making frantic calls to local luxury auto dealerships and private exotic car brokers. He completely bypassed all the normal, careful negotiations and aggressively demanded immediate cash offers. The seasoned brokers sensed his sheer blinding desperation immediately through the phone. They offered him incredibly low purchase prices that were barely half of what the pristine vehicles were actually worth. Trevor did not care about the massive financial loss or the insult to his pride. He was a drowning man gasping for air, and he gladly accepted the terrible terms just to get his hands on liquid cash. He arranged to sell both sports cars and the luxury boat to a single aggressive wholesale buyer who promised to wire the funds within 3 hours. Trevor felt a brief, pathetic surge of artificial hope. He truly thought he had successfully outsmarted the trap I had set for him. He rushed back inside the house and printed out the electronic title transfer documents. He signed his name on the designated lines with a violently trembling hand. The wholesale vehicle buyer arrived at the house exactly an hour later, driving a massive, heavy-duty flatbed transport truck. The buyer walked slowly around the expensive vehicles and nodded his head in deep satisfaction. He pulled out a digital tablet to initiate the mandatory electronic transfer of the vehicle titles through the state motor vehicle database. Trevor stood in the driveway, sweating profusely and watching the bright screen. He desperately needed those funds to hit his personal bank account immediately so he could wire the massive payment to the commercial bank and stop the foreclosure. The buyer entered the long vehicle identification numbers and submitted the official transfer request. The digital screen loaded for a few agonizing seconds while Trevor held his breath. A bright red error message suddenly flashed aggressively across the tablet. The buyer frowned and tapped the screen again, but the identical red warning message appeared, blocking the transaction completely. The state database explicitly rejected the title transfer. The buyer looked at Trevor with deep suspicion and read the error code aloud. The automated system indicated that a comprehensive legal hold had been placed on every single piece of registered property tied to Trevor and his personal Social Security number. Trevor snatched the tablet directly from the hands of the buyer and stared blindly at the glowing red letters. He did not understand how this was physically possible. He pulled out his own phone and frantically dialed his primary personal bank. He navigated through the long automated menus and finally reached a live customer service representative. He demanded to know why his personal assets were suddenly frozen and completely inaccessible. The bank representative placed him on a brief silent hold and then returned with information that completely shattered his remaining reality. While the federal detectives were busy investigating Melanie for wire fraud, my attorney Bradley Foster had been aggressively executing a devastating civil maneuver directly behind the scenes. Bradley did not just file a simple family lawsuit in a local county court. He had meticulously compiled a massive mountain of undeniable evidence detailing their long history of financial exploitation and the highly orchestrated fraudulent house theft. Bradley took that massive pile of evidence directly to a federal judge and officially filed a massive civil racketeering and corrupt organizations lawsuit against both Trevor and Melanie. He sued them for systematic elder abuse, intentional real estate fraud, and the deliberate infliction of severe emotional distress. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act is a federal law traditionally used to completely dismantle organized crime syndicates. Bradley expertly used it to legally categorize my son and his wife as a criminal enterprise functioning solely to drain my wealth. As a direct part of that incredibly aggressive civil lawsuit, the federal judge had immediately granted a comprehensive temporary restraining order against all of their personal property. The federal court officially froze every single bank account, every single vehicle title, and every single investment portfolio connected to their names. They were legally prohibited from selling, liquidating, or transferring any assets whatsoever until the massive civil trial was fully resolved. Trevor dropped his phone onto the hard concrete driveway. The screen shattered into dozens of sharp pieces. The wholesale buyer immediately realized the vehicles were legally toxic and wanted absolutely nothing to do with the situation. The buyer climbed back into his heavy transport truck and drove away without saying a single word. Trevor stood completely alone in the driveway, surrounded by millions of dollars worth of luxury vehicles that he was legally forbidden to touch. He was completely and utterly financially paralyzed. He could not sell the expensive cars to pay the commercial bank. He could not access his savings to hire a criminal defense attorney for his wife. He could not even buy a cheap bus ticket to flee the state. I had not just locked him out of his stolen house. I had systematically locked him inside a burning room and carefully removed every single exit. He fell to his knees on the cold concrete. He finally understood the true terrifying depth of the silent adjustment. His entire life was officially seized, and he was completely powerless to stop his own impending destruction. The sun had already set over the city, leaving the skyline glowing with thousands of bright artificial lights. I was sitting in my favorite leather armchair in the penthouse reading a classic novel and listening to a quiet jazz record playing in the background. My phone began to vibrate violently against the glass surface of the coffee table. I looked down and saw Trevor calling. I let it ring 5 times before I finally picked it up. I did not say hello. I simply held the phone to my ear and listened to the heavy, ragged breathing on the other end of the line. The arrogant, demanding real estate investor who had screamed at me in the marble lobby just hours ago was completely gone. In his place was a broken, terrified little boy, sobbing uncontrollably into the receiver. Trevor did not even try to maintain his composure. He immediately launched into a pathetic, frantic stream of begging and pleading. His voice cracked and pitched upward as he described the absolute nightmare he was currently living. He told me about the frozen bank accounts and the massive federal civil lawsuit. He cried about the heavy transport truck driving away and leaving him completely paralyzed with millions of dollars in useless frozen assets. He begged me to call my attorney Bradley Foster and order him to drop the devastating civil case immediately. He pleaded with me to contact the massive commercial bank and wire the $1.8 million to satisfy the loan and stop the impending 14-day foreclosure. He sounded like a drowning man desperately clawing at a life preserver that was floating just out of his reach. Then he offered me what he genuinely believed was the ultimate concession. He choked back his tears and promised me that he would give the house back. He told me he would drive down to the county clerk office first thing in the morning and sign whatever paperwork I wanted to officially reverse the quitclaim deed. He promised to dissolve his corporate entity and erase the entire transaction. He tried to frame his massive calculated theft as a simple family misunderstanding that we could easily fix together. He begged me to remember the good times we shared when he was a child. He brought up family vacations and holidays, trying to blindly dig through the wreckage to find the loving father he had so eagerly tried to destroy. He swore that if I just saved him from the bank and the police, he would never ask me for another dime for the rest of his life. I sat in my quiet, luxurious apartment and let him talk until his voice gave out completely. I did not interrupt his frantic bargaining. I listened to his desperate apologies and recognized them for exactly what they were. He was not sorry that he had stolen my house. He was not sorry that he had tried to lock me away in a medical facility against my will. He was only sorry that he had walked blindly into a devastating trap and gotten caught. His tears were entirely born of self-pity and absolute terror. When he finally stopped talking, there was a long, agonizing silence on the line. I took a deep breath and shattered his fragile delusions with the cold, hard hammer of reality. I spoke in a quiet, measured tone that offered absolutely zero comfort. I told him that he fundamentally misunderstood how the adult world operated. I explained that you cannot simply unring a bell once it has been struck. I told him that walking into a bank with a forged federal document and legally transferring a stolen deed into a fraudulent corporate entity were not minor family mistakes. Those were intentional, premeditated felony crimes. I explained that returning the stolen property after the police arrive does not magically erase the theft. I told him the Federal Financial Crimes Task Force did not care about his apologies or his sudden change of heart. They possessed the physical laptop, the forged documents, and the digital footprints of his massive conspiracy. The criminal justice machine was already moving at full speed, and I had absolutely no power to stop it, even if I wanted to. I then addressed his pathetic offer to return my home. I told him very clearly that I had absolutely no desire to take the property back. I described how the house had felt when I watched the hidden camera footage. I told him that the home where I had raised my family was completely gone. In its place was a contaminated crime scene entirely tainted by his disgusting, boundless greed. I told him that every single hallway and every single room now reeked of his betrayal and his arrogant cruelty. I explained that I would never sleep comfortably under that roof again, knowing what he and his wife had done there. I told him that the massive commercial bank was more than welcome to seize the property and sell it to the highest bidder, because the physical bricks and mortar meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. Trevor began to hyperventilate through the phone. He realized that his ultimate bargaining chip was completely worthless to me. He started screaming my name, begging me not to abandon him to the police and the bank. He asked me how I could possibly sit back and watch my own flesh and blood go to federal prison. I kept my voice perfectly steady and delivered my final verdict. I reminded him that he was the one who had eagerly severed our family ties the moment he changed the locks on my front door. I told him that he had looked at his own father and saw nothing but a disposable obstacle standing between him and a pile of money. I told him that I was simply allowing the natural, severe consequences of his own horrific choices to wash over him. I explained that I would not spend a single penny of my protected wealth to save a man who had actively plotted my total destruction. I told Trevor that this would be the very last time we ever spoke. I advised him to stop wasting his energy calling me and to start figuring out how he was going to survive his impending federal indictment. I did not wait for his response. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the button to end the call. The line went completely dead. I immediately opened my phone settings and permanently blocked his number. I blocked Melanie and her number as well. I sat back in my leather armchair and took a slow, deep breath. The begging phase was officially over. I had systematically removed every single safety net they had ever relied on. I had completely isolated them from my wealth and my protection. The massive trap was fully sprung, and there was nothing left for me to do but watch the inevitable total collapse of their arrogant empire. I picked up my classic novel and found my page feeling an incredible, profound sense of peace wash over my entire soul. The silent adjustment had successfully severed the diseased branch of my family tree forever. The 14th day arrived with a cold, gray morning that perfectly matched the bleak reality of their situation. Trevor and Melanie had spent the last 2 weeks trapped inside the massive empty house like terrified prisoners waiting for an inevitable execution. The digital clock on the kitchen counter slowly ticked closer to the close of business hours. Trevor had exhausted every single possible option available to a desperate man. He had frantically called every shady predatory lender and high-risk private equity firm in the state. He begged for a bridge loan or a temporary cash injection. Every single one of them laughed and hung up the phone the moment he mentioned the property was entangled in a federal racketeering lawsuit and an active criminal wire fraud investigation. The $1.8 million commercial debt remained entirely unpaid. The massive national bank did not send another friendly warning letter. They did not call his cell phone to negotiate a payment plan or offer a brief extension. Corporate financial institutions do not possess a conscience or a sense of human pity. They operate with ruthless mathematical efficiency. They view the world entirely through the cold lens of risk and liability. The exact second the 14-day deadline expired, the heavy machinery of their commercial foreclosure department slammed down with devastating force. The following morning, the quiet, peaceful atmosphere of my old suburban street was violently disrupted. I watched the entire beautiful event unfold in real time through the live high-definition video feed of a discreet security camera. I had paid a private technician a premium fee to install the small device on a telephone pole across the street weeks ago. I sat in my comfortable leather armchair, sipping my morning coffee as 3 large vehicles pulled aggressively into the long gravel driveway. A white commercial locksmith van parked directly behind 2 heavy black sport utility vehicles. 4 heavily armed county bailiffs stepped out of the black vehicles wearing thick, dark tactical vests and carrying official metal clipboards. They were accompanied by a senior asset recovery agent employed directly by the commercial bank. The recovery agent wore a sharp gray suit and carried a thick briefcase filled with court orders. They marched up the pristine stone pathway, moving together with absolute, undeniable authority. They did not care about the perfectly manicured lawn or the expensive staging furniture visible through the large front windows. They viewed the $1.9 million house simply as a compromised financial asset that needed to be immediately secured and liquidated to cover a massive corporate loss. The lead armed bailiff pounded his heavy fist against the solid oak front door. The heavy thud echoed loudly across the manicured lawns of the neighborhood. Trevor opened the door slowly, looking exactly like a walking ghost. His eyes were completely hollow and sunken deep into his skull. His expensive tailored clothes were wrinkled and hung loosely on his shrinking frame. The bailiff did not offer a polite morning greeting. He immediately shoved a bright yellow court order directly into Trevor and his chest. The heavy paper was stamped with the imposing red seal of a federal judge. The bank representative stepped forward and coldly informed Trevor that the property was now officially under the exclusive legal possession of the commercial lending institution. Trevor tried to push back using his last remaining ounce of pathetic arrogance. He tried to aggressively quote standard tenant rights and residential eviction timelines. He frantically insisted that they legally had to give him a formal 30-day written notice to vacate the premises. He claimed he had a fundamental constitutional right to stay in the house while he hired lawyers and sorted out the complicated legal paperwork. The senior bank representative looked at him with absolute total disgust and systematically shattered his final delusion. He spoke in a loud, clear voice that carried easily to the hidden microphone across the street. He explained that standard eviction protections only apply to legitimate renters and lawful property owners. He told Trevor that because he had utilized a forged power of attorney to fraudulently force the deed into a dummy corporation, the entire real estate transaction was legally void from the very beginning. The bank had successfully filed an emergency injunction in federal court citing severe criminal fraud. Trevor was not legally considered a tenant or a homeowner. The court had officially classified him as a hostile criminal trespasser, illegally occupying a stolen corporate asset. The bank did not need a 30-day eviction notice. They had a federal mandate for immediate hostile. The bailiffs unclipped their heavy black batons and ordered Trevor and Melanie to step out of the house immediately. Melanie came running down the long hallway from the master bedroom. She was breathing heavily and carrying a massive designer suitcase stuffed to the brim with expensive jewelry and high-end clothes. She was desperately trying to salvage whatever physical wealth she could carry. One of the massive armed bailiffs immediately stepped directly into her path. He reached out and ripped the heavy leather suitcase directly out of her shaking hands. He sternly informed her that absolutely nothing was allowed to leave the premises. He reminded her in a loud, booming voice that the federal judge had placed a comprehensive freeze on all of their personal assets due to the ongoing racketeering lawsuit. The bank also maintained a blanket lien on the entire physical contents of the house to help satisfy the massive outstanding debt. Every single piece of gold jewelry, every designer dress, and every expensive electronic device now legally belonged to the federal court and the commercial bank. Melanie began to scream and cry hysterically. She threw a massive temper tantrum right there in the foyer, stamping her feet and demanding her stolen property back. The bailiffs showed absolutely zero mercy or patience for her dramatic display. 2 officers grabbed Trevor by his arms, and 2 other officers grabbed Melanie. They physically dragged them out the front door, ignoring their loud, frantic protests. They marched them roughly down the stone pathway and pushed them forcefully onto the damp grass of the front lawn. Several neighbors had stepped out onto their front porches to watch the incredible spectacle. The people who Trevor and Melanie had tried to impress with their stolen wealth were now witnessing their absolute humiliating destruction. Trevor stumbled forward and fell onto his knees right next to the neighborhood sidewalk. He looked up just in time to watch the commercial locksmith walk casually up to the front door, holding a heavy power drill. The sound of the spinning metal drill bit echoed loudly across the quiet suburban street. It was the exact same mechanical grinding noise I had encountered on that very same front porch exactly 2 months ago. The locksmith swiftly removed the shiny new brass cylinder that Trevor had so proudly installed when he initiated his massive theft. He threw the useless lock into the bushes. He quickly replaced it with a heavy-duty industrial commercial deadbolt designed specifically to keep out aggressive squatters and criminals. The massive poetic irony of the situation was absolutely beautiful to witness. Trevor had ruthlessly changed the locks on his own devoted father in a greedy attempt to steal a fortune and fund his early retirement. Now a massive faceless financial institution was executing that exact same brutal action against him, with zero hesitation. The bailiff slammed the heavy oak door shut. The new industrial deadbolt clicked into place with a loud final echoing thud that signaled the absolute end of his empire. Trevor and Melanie were left sitting on the cold, damp grass, shivering in the morning air. They were wearing nothing but the wrinkled clothes on their backs. They were completely locked out of the house they had destroyed their entire lives to steal. They had absolutely no money, no shelter, no legal recourse, and no hope of rescue. They were completely paralyzed by the catastrophic consequences of their own actions. I took a long, slow sip of my hot coffee and smiled at the computer monitor. The silent adjustment had reached its perfect symmetrical climax. The cold morning wind swept down the quiet suburban street, carrying dry leaves across the pristine, manicured lawns. Trevor and Melanie sat on the hard concrete curb, completely stripped of their dignity and their stolen wealth. The armed county bailiffs had allowed them to take absolutely nothing of value from the property. Before the heavy commercial deadbolt was locked, the officers had carelessly tossed 3 cheap cardboard boxes onto the front grass. The boxes contained nothing but basic toiletries, worn-out shoes, and a few meaningless personal photographs. The massive designer suitcases filled with expensive jewelry and high-end clothing remained locked inside the house under the strict jurisdiction of the federal court and the commercial bank. Trevor stared blankly at the scattered cardboard boxes. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life defining his personal worth by the expensive items he owned and the luxury vehicles he drove. Now he was sitting on a public sidewalk with absolutely nothing to his name. The neighborhood residents who had previously admired the expansive $1.9 million estate now stood on their front porches, whispering and pointing. The exact people Trevor had desperately tried to impress with his fabricated success story were now the silent witnesses to his absolute humiliating downfall. Melanie sat next to him on the cold concrete, shivering in her thin designer dress. She wrapped her arms around her knees and buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. The explosive, arrogant rage she had displayed during the eviction had completely burned out. It was replaced by the hollow, terrifying realization that she was entirely powerless. They had spent weeks living inside a magnificent golden castle, completely unaware that it was actually a meticulously designed steel cage. I sat in my quiet downtown penthouse and watched the pathetic scene unfold through the live high-definition feed of my hidden street camera. I felt absolutely no pity for either of them. They were simply reaping the inevitable catastrophic harvest of the toxic seeds they had so eagerly planted. The heavy silence of the neighborhood was suddenly broken by the aggressive roar of powerful car engines. Two familiar, dark, unmarked police sedans turned the corner and accelerated rapidly down the street. The vehicles did not park neatly along the curb. They pulled up aggressively and angled their heavy frames directly toward the sidewalk, completely boxing in Trevor and Melanie. The doors of the sedans opened simultaneously. The exact same team of plainclothes federal detectives who had raided the house a few days prior stepped out onto the asphalt. They moved with a highly focused, predatory energy. Trevor looked up from the concrete and felt a brief, irrational surge of hope. His mind was so deeply fractured by the morning events that he actually believed the police had returned to help him. He thought perhaps they had realized the eviction was a massive mistake and had come to force the bank to give him the house back. He slowly stood up from the curb and took a hesitant step toward the lead detective. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat the moment he saw the cold, uncompromising expression on the face of the federal officer. The lead detective did not ask them how they were doing. He did not offer any sympathy for their current homeless status. He walked directly up to Trevor and stopped just 2 feet away, invading his personal space with absolute authority. He looked down at the pathetic cardboard boxes and then looked directly into the terrified eyes of my son. He spoke in a loud, booming voice that was clearly captured by my hidden microphone across the street. He informed Trevor that the Cybercrimes Division had spent the entire weekend completely dismantling the security encryptions on Melanie and her silver laptop computer. He explained that digital forensic analysts do not just look at recent documents. They possess the technology to recover every single deleted file, every hidden folder, and every erased communication log. The detectives stated with brutal clarity that they had uncovered an absolute mountain of undeniable, premeditated criminal evidence. Trevor felt his knees weaken as the detective began to recite the specific details of their private communications. The analysts had recovered a long chain of explicit emails sent between Trevor and Melanie precisely 2 weeks before I departed for my European vacation. In those emails, they coldly and meticulously outlined their exact plan to isolate me and steal my entire estate. The detective quoted a specific message where Melanie complained about the cost of my potential future medical care and suggested they liquidate my assets immediately while I was out of the country. They had recovered the digital search history, showing Trevor researching how to bypass standard notary requirements and how to quickly form a dummy corporate entity to shield stolen real estate. The detective explained that they even found a scanned practice sheet where Melanie had spent hours repeatedly tracing my signature to ensure the forged power of attorney document looked completely authentic. The illusion of a simple family misunderstanding was permanently destroyed. The digital footprint proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that they had executed a highly coordinated malicious conspiracy to defraud a vulnerable family member. Melanie stopped crying and stared at the detective in absolute frozen horror. She realized that her own expensive computer had become the ultimate star witness against her. The detective turned his cold gaze toward her and delivered the final legal blow. He informed her that based on the recovered digital evidence, the federal prosecutor had officially signed the formal arrest warrants just 1 hour ago. He recited the specific criminal charges with the rhythmic mechanical precision of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. He looked at Melanie and officially placed her under arrest for 1 count of felony wire fraud, 1 count of bank fraud, and 1 count of uttering a forged federal document. He then turned back to Trevor and officially placed him under arrest for 1 count of felony conspiracy to commit fraud and 1 count of grand theft of real estate. The 2 remaining detectives stepped forward simultaneously. They pulled heavy steel handcuffs from their utility belts. They did not ask politely for compliance. They grabbed Trevor and Melanie by their arms, spun them around, and forcefully secured their wrists behind their backs. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place echoed loudly across the quiet street. It was the definitive sound of their absolute, total defeat. The lead detective calmly recited their Miranda rights, warning them that anything they said would be used against them in a federal court of law. Trevor did not fight back. He did not scream or threaten to sue anyone. The fight had been completely drained out of his body. He hung his head in absolute shame as the detectives marched him toward the back door of the unmarked police cruiser. Melanie stumbled blindly beside him, her expensive designer dress dragging against the dirty asphalt. The detectives placed them roughly into the cramped back seat of the police vehicle and slammed the heavy door shut. As the police engines idled, waiting to transport them to the federal detention center, a large flatbed commercial truck turned onto the street. The truck belonged to the private property management firm, contracted by the commercial bank. A crew of workers wearing heavy work boots and hard hats jumped out of the truck, carrying portable generators, heavy power drills, and thick sheets of industrial plywood. I watched closely through the camera monitor as the workers marched up the manicured lawn of the $1.9 million house. They did not care about the beautiful architecture or the custom paint job. They immediately began lifting the heavy wooden boards and drilling long steel screws directly into the expensive window frames. The loud, aggressive grinding noise of the power tools filled the neighborhood air. Trevor and Melanie sat locked in the back of the police cruiser and were forced to watch through the reinforced glass window. They watched as the workers systematically sealed up every single entrance and every single window of the magnificent home they had destroyed their entire lives to steal. They watched the physical manifestation of their boundless greed being completely boarded up and shut down forever. The house was no longer a symbol of their unearned wealth. It was a dark, empty tomb. The police sedans finally pulled away from the curb, leaving the pathetic cardboard boxes sitting abandoned on the sidewalk. I closed my laptop screen and turned off the camera feed. The trap had executed flawlessly from beginning to end. My wealth was completely secure in the offshore trust, my pristine medical records protected my autonomy, and the criminal justice system had permanently removed the threats from my life. I walked over to the large windows of my penthouse and looked out over the sprawling, beautiful city, feeling lighter and freer than I had in 20 years. The silent adjustment was complete, and the brutal, necessary order of my world had been perfectly restored. 6 months passed since the morning the heavy commercial deadbolt locked my son out of his stolen empire. The seasons changed, and the bitter cold of winter gave way to a crisp, bright spring morning. I walked through the heavy bronze doors of the federal courthouse downtown. The building was a massive, intimidating structure of polished granite and dark wood. It was a place designed entirely to strip away the illusions of arrogant people and replace them with the crushing weight of the law. I passed through the rigorous security checkpoints with a steady heartbeat. I walked into the expansive gallery of the designated courtroom and took a seat in the second row. The wooden bench was hard and unforgiving. The room was mostly empty except for a few court reporters and a handful of curious law clerks. I sat perfectly still with my hands folded, resting on my lap. I did not feel the nervous anxiety of a father waiting to see his child. I felt the absolute cold detachment of a man arriving to witness the final mathematical equation of a long, complex problem finally being solved. A heavy wooden door on the side of the courtroom opened with a loud echoing click. A stern-armed federal marshal walked into the room, followed immediately by two figures shuffling slowly behind him. The air in the courtroom seemed to instantly grow colder. I looked at the two people being led toward the defense table. Trevor and Melanie were completely unrecognizable from the wealthy, arrogant power couple who had once sipped stolen champagne and laughed at my supposed mental decline. They were wearing standard-issue bright orange inmate uniforms. The cheap, stiff fabric hung loosely on their shrinking frames. Their wrists and ankles were secured with heavy steel chains that rattled loudly with every single step they took across the polished floor. The physical toll of spending 6 months inside a federal holding facility had completely ravaged them. Melanie had lost her pristine designer hairstyle. Her hair was dull and tied back in a messy knot. Her face was pale and drawn, completely drained of the fierce, vindictive energy she had once weaponized against me. Trevor looked even worse. He walked with a heavy, defeated stoop, his shoulders slumped forward under the invisible weight of his absolute ruin. His arrogant posture was completely gone. He refused to look back at the gallery. He kept his hollow, sunken eyes glued directly to the floor. The luxury vehicles, the expensive tailored suits, and the multi-million-dollar real estate portfolios were entirely erased. They were reduced to numbers in a federal prison system. The federal judge entered the courtroom. Everyone rose to their feet. The judge was an older woman with sharp, piercing eyes and a reputation for handing down maximum penalties in financial fraud cases. She sat behind her elevated wooden bench and looked down at Trevor and Melanie with a profound expression of utter disdain. The federal prosecutor stood up and formally addressed the court. There would be no drawn-out, highly publicized trial. Trevor and Melanie had completely exhausted their legal options. Their expensive defense attorneys had quickly realized that the mountain of digital evidence recovered from the laptop made a trial absolutely suicidal. To avoid the maximum possible prison sentences, they had agreed to sign a comprehensive plea deal. The prosecutor read the brutal facts of the case out loud into the official public record. He detailed the forged power of attorney, the fraudulent real estate transfer, the attempted theft of my bank accounts, and the massive commercial loan default. He spoke clearly and methodically, leaving absolutely no room for misunderstanding or sympathy. Trevor and Melanie stood before the judge and were forced to publicly admit their guilt. When the judge asked Trevor how he pleaded to the felony charges, his voice was barely a whisper. He choked on his own words and whispered the word guilty. Melanie followed immediately after him, crying softly as she admitted her own undeniable guilt to the federal magistrate. The judge did not simply accept the plea and move on to the sentencing phase. She leaned forward over her bench and delivered a scathing, devastating lecture that completely stripped away any tiny remaining shred of their dignity. She told them that in her 30 years on the federal bench, she had seen countless acts of corporate greed and financial manipulation. But she stated clearly that their specific crimes were born of a unique and profoundly disgusting moral bankruptcy. She looked directly at Trevor and told him that he was a disgrace to the very concept of family. She reminded him that the man he had ruthlessly targeted was the exact same man who had funded his entire privileged existence. She told him that his attempt to forcefully declare a perfectly sane, generous father legally incompetent was an act of absolute cowardly cruelty. She told Melanie that her eagerness to exploit a vulnerable elder for a quick cash payout demonstrated a complete lack of human empathy. The judge stated that they did not commit these crimes out of desperation or poverty. They committed these crimes out of pure, unchecked gluttony and a toxic belief that the rules of society simply did not apply to them. She systematically dismantled their characters, leaving them standing in the silent courtroom, completely naked to the harsh judgment of the law. The courtroom was completely silent when the judge finally reached for her heavy wooden gavel. She looked down at the sentencing guidelines and then back at the two broken people standing in chains. She announced that the severity of their betrayal and the massive financial scope of the fraud demanded a harsh, unyielding consequence. She sentenced Melanie to 7 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and the forgery of federal documents. She then turned her gaze to Trevor. Because he was the primary architect of the real estate theft and the direct beneficiary of the fraudulent corporate entity, she sentenced him to 10 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down onto the sounding block with a loud cracking noise that echoed through the vast room. The sound signaled the absolute permanent end of their lives as they knew them. The federal marshals immediately stepped forward and grabbed them by their arms to lead them back to the holding cells. Trevor finally turned his head and looked back into the gallery. Our eyes locked for one brief, fleeting second. He looked at me with a face completely consumed by terror and absolute regret. I did not offer him a comforting nod. I did not shed a single tear. I sat perfectly still with a cold, blank expression on my face. I watched them shuffle through the side door and disappear into the dark hallways of the justice system. I felt absolutely no sympathy for the son I had lost. I felt only the pure, cold, profound satisfaction of flawless justice. The devastating equation was finally balanced. While the criminal justice system systematically processed their physical bodies, my attorney Bradley Foster methodically dismantled whatever remained of their financial futures. The federal civil racketeering lawsuit did not simply vanish just because Trevor and Melanie were securely locked inside prison cells. The civil court judge spent several days carefully reviewing the massive mountain of digital evidence and the official guilty pleas originating from the criminal trial. The final ruling was incredibly swift and absolutely devastating to their legacy. The court awarded me massive compensatory and punitive damages, citing the extreme malicious intent behind their highly coordinated conspiracy. The sweeping legal judgment officially authorized the permanent seizure of their frozen bank accounts and the forced, immediate liquidation of the luxury sports cars and the expensive speedboat. Every single dollar they had ever accumulated during their arrogant reign was legally extracted and securely redirected into my private holding accounts. The money was intended to cover the immense emotional distress and the complex legal fees they had so selfishly forced upon me. Bradley expertly ensured that the financial punishment would last a lifetime. He structured the judgment so that even when they eventually walked out of prison decades from now, their future wages would be heavily and permanently garnished. They would never be able to legally own a home or secure a basic line of credit for the rest of their natural lives. The civil judgment was an invisible, permanent financial cage built perfectly to their exact measurements. Meanwhile, the massive National Commercial Bank moved aggressively forward with the hostile liquidation of the $1.9 million property. The bank had absolutely no interest in maintaining and holding on to vacant suburban real estate. They simply viewed the stolen house as a severely compromised asset, bleeding money every single day on their balance sheets. The Commercial Lending Division officially scheduled a public foreclosure auction on the cold concrete steps of the county courthouse. Real estate auctions are notoriously brutal and unforgiving environments where properties are frequently sold for mere fractions of their actual appraised value. The bank desperately wanted to recover whatever liquid cash they could to offset their massive $1.8 million loss. The public auction was held on a freezing rainy Tuesday morning. A small handful of local real estate investors and opportunistic property flippers gathered under the stone awning of the courthouse holding their numbered bidding paddles. They had all thoroughly read the mandatory public legal disclosures. They knew the property was deeply entangled in a highly publicized felony fraud case and carried a heavy dark legal stigma. The initial bidding started incredibly low. The investors were highly hesitant to tie up their capital in a house that had just served as the primary crime scene for a federal racketeering syndicate. The bank representative stood in the rain and watched with deep corporate frustration as the bids trickled in at a painfully slow pace. I did not attend the public auction in person. I sat in the quiet, warm comfort of Bradley Foster and his mahogany conference room, sipping hot black tea. Bradley had spent the previous 2 weeks establishing a completely anonymous proxy corporation legally registered in a separate state. We hired a ruthless, independent real estate broker to attend the rainy auction and bid exclusively on behalf of this invisible corporate entity. As the local investors hesitantly offered $500,000, our broker aggressively raised his paddle and outbid them by massive, intimidating increments. The other prospective buyers quickly dropped out of the race, unwilling to engage in a reckless bidding war for a legally tainted asset. The auctioneer slammed his heavy brass gavel down onto the podium and officially sold the property to my anonymous proxy corporation for exactly $800,000. The sheer brilliant mathematics of the situation were absolutely staggering to contemplate. I had originally drained $1.8 million of equity out of the house and hidden it safely in an impenetrable offshore trust. I had just effortlessly used a tiny fraction of that exact same extracted money to buy the entire property back, completely free and clear of any commercial debts. I had successfully protected my ancestral home, completely destroyed my enemies, and walked away with a pure, untaxed cash profit of $1 million. The bank absorbed the massive loss, and my son went to prison for a theft that ultimately made me wealthier. The county clerk officially recorded the new legal deed later that same afternoon. I drove my car back to the quiet suburban street and parked in the familiar driveway. I pulled out a brand new key and unlocked the heavy commercial deadbolt the bank had installed. I walked through the empty, echoing rooms of my home for the first time in 6 months. The cheap synthetic vanilla candles they had used for the open house were completely gone, leaving behind only the stale, stagnant scent of their spectacular failure. I walked into the kitchen and looked at the expensive staging furniture they had so proudly rented to sell my legacy. I did not want any of it remaining inside my walls. I pulled out my phone and hired a massive crew of premium private contractors. I ordered them to bring heavy demolition equipment and massive commercial dumpsters to the property the very next morning. I instructed the construction foreman to completely tear out the hardwood floors, the custom kitchen cabinets, and every single light fixture my son and his wife had ever touched. I wanted the entire interior of the house ripped down to the bare wooden framing studs. I paid the contractors double their standard daily rate to work around the clock, with extreme prejudice. They systematically erased every single physical trace of Trevor and Melanie from the property. The heavy sledgehammers and loud power saws demolished the spaces where they had stood and plotted my ultimate destruction. The house was completely sanitized and heavily purged of their toxic, boundless greed. I stood in the center of the completely demolished living room, breathing in the sharp, clean smell of fresh sawdust and exposed timber. The physical space was finally stripped bare and ready to be beautifully rebuilt, matching the pristine, restored order of my own life. The afternoon mail arrived at the penthouse exactly at 3 o'clock. I sat at my polished marble kitchen island, sorting through the stack of thick envelopes. Among the sleek magazines and corporate financial reports, I found a single piece of cheap, thin paper folded unevenly into a standard white envelope. The return address was stamped in bright red ink. It bore the unmistakable official seal of a maximum security federal penitentiary located 3 states away. The handwriting on the front was incredibly familiar. It was the frantic, uneven scrawl of my son, Trevor. He had been incarcerated for exactly 8 months, and the crushing reality of his 10-year sentence had finally broken through his stubborn pride. I looked at the cheap envelope resting against the cool marble surface. I did not feel a sudden rush of paternal anxiety or a familiar ache in my chest. I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional bond that had once tied me to him was completely dead. I picked up a silver letter opener and sliced through the top of the envelope. I pulled out a single sheet of lined notebook paper. The handwriting was smudged and chaotic. I unfolded the paper and allowed my eyes to scan the very first sentence. Trevor did not start the letter by expressing deep remorse for his horrific crimes. He did not ask about my health or apologize for attempting to destroy my life and steal my home. His very first words were a pathetic, manipulative plea for cash. He wrote that the prison food was completely inedible and begged me to deposit $500 into his inmate commissary account so he could buy basic snacks and hygiene supplies. He immediately slipped right back into his lifelong habit of viewing me strictly as an automated teller machine. Even after losing his freedom, his marriage, and his entire future, he still fundamentally believed that his father existed solely to fund his comfort. He honestly thought he could simply write a sad letter and magically reactivate the endless flow of my wealth. I did not read the second sentence. I did not care about his complaints or his fabricated prison hardships. The complete lack of accountability in that single opening line was all the absolute proof I needed to finalize my decision. I folded the cheap notebook paper in half and walked across the expansive living room. I slid open the heavy glass doors and stepped out onto my private penthouse balcony. The wind was blowing steadily across the towering downtown skyscrapers. I stood near the thick glass railing and looked down at the sprawling city far below. I held the letter up into the cold, rushing air. I did not burn it in a dramatic display of anger. I simply gripped the paper with both hands and began to tear it into tiny pieces. I shredded the cheap paper into tiny white squares until the words were completely unrecognizable. I opened my hands and let the strong wind catch the pieces. They scattered instantly and disappeared into the vast urban canyon, completely swallowed by the city. I watched the last tiny fragment vanish, and I felt a profound, heavy weight lift permanently off my shoulders. The toxic, lingering ghost of my son was finally gone. I walked back inside the penthouse and immediately picked up my phone to call my attorney, Bradley Foster. The time had come to execute the absolute final phase of the silent adjustment. I instructed Bradley to draft the most ironclad, restrictive legal documents his firm could possibly produce. I told him I wanted to officially and permanently, legally, disown Trevor. In the state where I reside, you cannot simply write a child out of a will by ignoring them. A greedy relative can always hire a sleazy lawyer to contest the estate and claim they were accidentally forgotten. I refused to leave even a microscopic loophole for Trevor to exploit after I was gone. I ordered Bradley to explicitly name Trevor in every single new estate document for the sole purpose of formally disinheriting him. The legal paperwork clearly stated that Trevor was to receive absolutely nothing from my estate under any circumstances whatsoever. We included specific language barring him from ever challenging the trust or claiming a single penny of my accumulated wealth. But I did not stop there. I needed to ensure that the massive fortune I had secured offshore and the new profits from the house sale served a truly meaningful purpose. I directed Bradley to completely restructure the massive offshore trust. I officially dissolved the previous beneficiary designations and established a massive private charitable foundation in my name. I instructed the legal team to direct every single dollar of my entire net worth into this new foundation upon my eventual passing. The money I had spent 40 years grinding to build would not be squandered on luxury sports cars or expensive champagne by a greedy, ungrateful child. It would be used to fund educational scholarships for underprivileged youth and to provide vital resources for elderly citizens facing financial abuse from their own families. I weaponized my legacy to fight the exact same horrific greed that had infected my own home. Bradley finalized the extensive paperwork by the end of the week. I sat in his mahogany conference room and signed my name on dozens of heavy legal pages with a steady hand. The notary public stamped the official seals, locking my final wishes into the permanent public record. The bloodline tie was completely and permanently severed. Trevor was no longer my heir, and he was no longer my responsibility. He was just a convicted federal inmate serving a 10-year sentence entirely alone in the world. He would eventually walk out of those prison gates as a middle-aged man with a felony record, no family, and absolutely zero financial prospects. He would be forced to secure a minimum wage job and learn how to survive in the real world without a safety net for the very first time in his entire life. I walked out of the law office and stepped onto the busy city sidewalk. The sun was shining brightly, and the air felt incredibly clean. I had completely successfully amputated the diseased limb from my family tree. I was no longer a victim waiting to be exploited. I was a free, wealthy man, completely unburdened by the toxic expectations of a son who had tried to bury me alive. The heavy oak front door swung open on perfectly oiled hinges. I stepped across the threshold of the $1.9 million house that was finally and undeniably mine again. The aggressive sounds of heavy demolition and power saws had long since faded away. In their place was the deep, resonant silence of a fortress that had been completely secured. The interior of the house was entirely unrecognizable from the sterile, staged environment my son had tried to sell to strangers. The cheap, synthetic flooring had been ripped out and replaced with thick, dark mahogany planks that absorbed the evening light. The walls were painted in rich, warm earth tones, completely erasing the cold, hospital white that Melanie had always preferred. I walked slowly through the expansive living room, admiring the custom-built stone fireplace that now dominated the space. It was a home rebuilt for a man who knew exactly who he was and exactly what he valued. Every single piece of furniture, every framed painting, and every woven rug was chosen strictly for my own comfort and my own pleasure. The lingering ghost of their toxic entitlement was entirely banished from these walls. I ran my hand along the smooth, polished surface of a heavy wooden bookshelf, feeling the solid reality of my reclaimed sanctuary. There were no more forced smiles, no more walking on eggshells, and absolutely no more leeches pretending to love me just to access my bank accounts. I walked down the long hallway and entered my newly constructed private study. The room smelled of rich leather and fresh ink. I sat down in a massive high-backed leather chair and opened my secure laptop. The glowing screen illuminated the dark room as I logged into my global financial portals. I spent the next hour quietly reviewing my entire economic portfolio. The numbers staring back at me were a testament to the absolute flawless execution of my plan. The massive offshore trust remained completely impenetrable, quietly generating substantial dividends in a secure foreign jurisdiction. The newly established charitable foundation was fully funded and already actively distributing grants to protect vulnerable elderly citizens. But the most satisfying detail was the massive cash surplus sitting securely in my domestic accounts. By legally extracting the $1.8 million of equity and then repurchasing the foreclosed property at public auction for a fraction of that price, I had generated a massive untaxed profit. I was significantly wealthier now than I was on the day I left for my European vacation. My financial armor was completely impenetrable. I did not have a single debt to my name, and my estate was permanently locked away from any greedy relatives. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the heavy chair. For the first time in 40 years, I felt completely financially free. I was no longer a blind provider for a parasitic family. I was the absolute, undisputed master of my own kingdom. I stood up from the desk and walked over to a custom-built mahogany wet bar tucked neatly into the corner of the study. I reached up to the highest shelf and pulled down a heavy crystal decanter filled with 20-year-old single-barrel bourbon. The amber liquid caught the warm ambient light of the room. I picked up a heavy crystal tumbler and poured a generous measure. The rich, complex aroma of toasted oak and dark caramel immediately filled the air. This was a bottle I had saved for years, waiting for a truly monumental occasion to open it. Trevor and Melanie had completely failed to find it during their frantic, greedy purge of my personal belongings. I raised the glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The warm, heavy liquid burned slightly as it went down, settling into a deep, comforting heat in my chest. I carried the heavy crystal glass out of the study and walked slowly back to the massive front living room. I stepped right up to the large bay window and looked out into the descending night. The quiet suburban street was perfectly still. The manicured lawns and tall oak trees were bathed in the soft yellow glow of the streetlights. It was the exact same stretch of concrete where my son had fallen to his knees and begged for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. It was the exact same sidewalk where federal detectives had snapped heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists and dragged him away to a couch. Now there was nothing out there but quiet, peaceful emptiness. I took another long sip of the expensive bourbon and let my mind wander back over the brutal events of the last year. I thought about the profound, terrifying power of human greed. I had survived a highly coordinated, vicious attack by the very people who were supposed to care for me in my old age. But I did not survive by screaming in crowded lobbies or throwing punches in the street. I did not survive by begging for my rights or engaging in pathetic emotional arguments with people who lacked a conscience. I survived by maintaining absolute silent composure. I simply studied the fundamental, predictable mechanics of their overwhelming greed. I understood that arrogant, entitled people will always sprint blindly toward a pile of money without ever checking the ground beneath their feet. I did not have to actively destroy my son. I simply opened a door to a massive financial trap and stepped completely out of his way. I allowed his own desperate urgency and his own toxic ego to serve as his absolute executioner. He locked himself inside a burning room because he was too busy counting the stolen money to notice the smell of smoke. I stood in the quiet warmth of my beautiful rebuilt home and felt the deep, resonant rhythm of true, absolute independence. The long, exhausting war was officially over. The betrayers were locked away in concrete cells facing the brutal, permanent consequences of their own horrific choices. The stolen wealth was not only returned, but exponentially multiplied. The dignity that they had tried to violently strip away from me on that front porch was fully and completely restored. I was 65 years old, and my life was finally entirely my own. There were no more forced compromises and no more hidden enemies waiting in the shadows of my own home. I raised my crystal glass one final time, offering a silent, solitary toast to the quiet, empty street outside my window. I drank the last remaining drop of the expensive bourbon and let the profound, heavy silence of the house wash over me. The massive, chaotic scales of justice were perfectly balanced. The ultimate order was fully restored. The silent adjustment was absolutely complete. The greatest lesson I learned from this ordeal is that true family is never defined by shared genetics or historical obligation. Blood simply makes you related, but loyalty, respect, and mutual care are what actually make you a family. When entitlement completely replaces gratitude, the people you love the most can easily become your most dangerous predators. You must never allow your lifelong generosity to become a weapon used against your own survival. True strength in your later years does not come from fighting loudly. It comes from silent preparation, absolute emotional clarity, and the unwavering courage to walk away from anyone who views your love as a weakness to be exploited. If you found value in this story of silent justice and reclaimed dignity, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences with setting boundaries in the comments below.